Hello and welcome to the first video for Unit 3. Unit 3 is our development and learning unit. And so in this unit, we will be talking about physical, social, and cognitive development, and also the development of language. We'll also be talking about how we develop learning. So classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and some other types of learning in there as well. So the first thing that we're going to jump into before we get into learning is development. And the question that we really want to answer with development is, how do humans change biologically, cognitively, and socially over the course of their lifespan? Before we can jump into those individual perspectives, however, we do need to talk a little bit about how we are going to study development over the course of the lifespan. So what are some of the themes that we're going to be noticing, and how do we go about studying development? By the end of this video, you should be able to answer the following two questions. How do enduring themes inform developmental psychology? And how are cross-sectional and longitudinal research design methods used in developmental psychology to inform understanding about behavior and mental processes? So let's jump in. First things first, developmental psychology. Really, this is answering the question of how we change throughout our lifespan. This is the branch of psychology that studies the physical, mental, and behavioral changes that occur from conception all the way to old age. And it really looks at the various things that influence our behavior. So biological, genetic, psychological, social, cultural, and environmental factors that affect development throughout our lifespan. In the field of developmental psychology, there are three major issues that are debated among developmental psychologists. The first is the question of nature versus nurture. And this is asking the question, which thing influences our development more? Is it our genetic inheritance, our nature, so our DNA that is passed down from our parents, that interacts with our experiences, our environment to influence our development? Or is it vice versa? Is our environment driving our development and our genetics are kind of responding to that? So what we're going to be doing throughout this unit is really investigating what are the aspects of our biology that influence our behavior, and what are the aspects of our environment that influence our behavior, and how do those two things work together? The next issue or theme that we're going to be looking at is the issue of continuity versus stages. And this really is looking at how are we developing throughout the lifespan? Is it gradual and continuous, like riding an escalator? So are we kind of always developing? Or do certain things abruptly change in stages, like climbing the stairs or a ladder? Are we going up individual stairs to a different level? Or are we gradually increasing our development? And so that's the question that we're going to look at. And we're going to look at some different psychologists who have different ideas of this. But this is one of the overarching themes of psychology. The final issue that we talk about in developmental psychology is the idea of stability versus change. And the question really is, do we stay the same throughout our lifespan? So are there traits that we have that are consistent, that persist throughout our life? Or do those traits change as we go through our different stages of life? So how do we study developmental psychology? The first and foremost way that we have kind of looked at the different parts of developmental psychology is through the use of twin studies. Now, before we get into what twin studies are, let's talk about the difference between the types of twins that we have. The first are identical twins, or monozygotic twins, or MZ twins. Identical twins come from the same egg and sperm. So one sperm fertilizes one egg, and we get our zygote. This zygote then splits and creates two completely separate beings. However, these two completely separate beings are genetically identical. They have the same DNA, the same genes. On the other hand, we have fraternal twins, or dizygotic twins. Dizygotic twins are two fertilized eggs that can exist in the same amniotic sac or have their own amniotic sacs. Fraternal twins are no more similar genetically than any other set of siblings. They just happen to be sharing the same womb. So there has been a lot of research using twins because if we use identical twins, we can control for nature, for biology, because identical twins have the same genes. So we have found that identical twins are much more similar than fraternal twins in many ways, such as their abilities, cognitive and physical abilities, their personalities, and their interests. One of the specific types of twin studies that we use are separated at birth studies. Now, we as psychologists don't go about separating twins on purpose anymore, but unfortunately, in the past, and sometimes by accident, this does happen. Identical twins are separated, and we can use these identical twins that were separated or brought up separately to look at if environment influences our development. And one of the most famous studies done with twins who are separated at birth are the Minnesota Twins Project at the University of Minnesota. This research was done by Thomas Bouchard, and it began in 1979, focusing on these identical twins who were reared apart. Research is still ongoing through this study, and they have studied over 100 pairs of identical twins that were separated at birth. Through this study, Bouchard and his team have found that heredity or genes accounted for 64 to 74% of the differences seen in IQ in identical twins, which means that IQ is somewhat genetically linked. So one of the reasons that twin studies are used is because we can have two genetically identical humans who were raised in completely separate environments. These two environments then can tell us if one twin is different than the other, then it must be the environment that played a role and not the genes, because the genes were the same. Another aspect of developmental psychology we need to talk about are the research methods that are used. We also use two other types of research methods. The first is cross-sectional research. Cross-sectional research is where individuals, typically of different ages or developmental levels, are compared at a single point in time. An example is a study that involves a direct comparison of 5-year-olds with 8-year-olds. We are using this only as a very small snapshot of development at 5 and at 8. So because this is just a snapshot, it's difficult really to determine the cause and effect relationship through a cross-sectional design. However, cross-sectional design can give us a lot of information in a very short amount of time. The next type of research that we use is longitudinal studies. And this is where a person or a small group of people is studied over the course of a very long period of time. For example, if there is a multi-year comparative study of the same children in an urban and suburban school to record their cognitive development in depth. So we're looking at the same kids. Let's say we look at them when they're in first grade at a school in Milwaukee versus a school in New Berlin. And these kids are studied when they're in first grade, when they're in third grade, when they're in fifth grade, when they're in seventh, and so on and so forth. And we look at their cognitive development over the course of their lifespan. This gives us a lot more cause and effect data because we're comparing the child to themselves at a previous age. The problem with longitudinal research is it's very expensive and it takes a very long time. So sometimes when we want to see a piece of information across the lifespan, it's easier for us to use that cross-sectional research in a small point in time and kind of account for those individual differences by including a very large sample.